All right, so we're diving deep today into this triangle, this
Yeah.
evolving situation between the U.S., Mexico, and China.
Yeah.
And I think what's really fascinating about it is how electric vehicles have kind of thrown a wrench in all this in terms
Hmm.
of global trade. And it's not just about cars.
Right.
It feels like a much bigger shift is happening, almost like a changing of the guard in terms of economic power.
Absolutely.
And it could completely redefine North America as we know it. I mean,
Right.
it's a big deal.
It is. And one of the things that I find really striking is how Mexico is positioning itself in all of this.
Yeah.
For decades, we've seen Mexico's economy as almost like an appendage to the U.S. economy.
Right.
But that seems to be changing pretty rapidly.
Yeah, you're right. It's like Mexico is stepping out onto the world stage with a newfound sense of autonomy.
Yeah.
And this brings us to China, a player whose moves are, I mean, I don't even know what the word is. They're captivating, to say the least.
They're bold, they're
That's
strategic,
good.
and they're happening very quickly.
Yeah, and they're putting their money where their mouth is.
Absolutely.
It's not just talk. They're investing billions of dollars in Mexico.
Yeah, we saw $2.3 billion invested between 2018 and 2023.
Wow.
And even just last year, in 2023 alone, they added another $150 million to that.
It's not just about spreading the wealth around, though, right?
Yeah.
There's a very clear strategic goal here.
It's about influence.
Yeah, it's about securing influence.
Mhm.
So I'm really curious about the specifics here. What sectors are they targeting?
Sure.
And what does that tell us about China's long-term ambitions?
Well, their focus is very strategic. They're heavily invested in automotive manufacturing,
Okay.
especially in electric vehicles.
Right.
But they're also putting resources into renewable energy and infrastructure.
Mm.
So they're not just setting up shop in Mexico. They're really weaving themselves into the very fabric of the Mexican economy.
Yeah, it's like they're building this whole ecosystem that's really primed for growth and poised to disrupt the existing power structure. And that 72% investment figure in Mexico's automotive sector is really sticking with me.
Right.
What do you think is driving that intense focus?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. First, they're tapping into Mexico's existing manufacturing expertise and skilled workforce.
Yeah.
But they're also leveraging those favorable trade agreements that Mexico has with the U.S. to really sidestep tariffs and gain a competitive advantage.
So it's about cost effectiveness.
Yes.
It's about market access.
Hmm.
But I feel like there's also this underlying technological ambition here.
Absolutely.
They're not just assembling cars in Mexico. They're pouring money into R&D and supply chain integration.
Right. China is playing the long game here. They're betting big on electric vehicles and positioning themselves to be the global leader in this industry.
And Mexico is like the linchpin in all this, with its resources, locations, skilled labor. I think that this brings us to the big question that's probably on everyone's mind listening to this. How does this all impact the U.S.?
Well, the U.S. is facing a new reality in North America. This huge influx of Chinese investment right on their doorstep is really intensifying competition.
Yeah.
And it's forcing them to rethink their traditional economic and political strategies in the region.
It's like a wake-up call.
I think so.
The U.S. can't just assume its dominance anymore.
Right.
And this leads us to another fascinating piece of this whole puzzle, this scramble for white gold.
Yes. Lithium.
Right, lithium.
Essential ingredient for electric vehicle batteries and a resource that is sparking a global gold rush.
Yeah, lithium is all of a sudden at the center of this massive geopolitical game.
Yes.
And China, as we've been talking about, is a master strategist.
They understand that controlling the supply of lithium is absolutely crucial for controlling the future of the electric vehicle market.
Mm-hmm.
And Mexico, which holds some of the world's largest lithium reserves, has become a prime target for China's ambitions.
This is where things get really interesting, right? It's not just about investing in Mexican EV production. They're making moves to control the raw materials, too.
Exactly. That 20-year liquefied natural gas deal that the Chinese energy giant JG Yang signed with Mexico Pacific in 2023 was a major power play.
It was huge.
It signaled their long-term commitment to Mexico and their intention to lock down a reliable supply of lithium.
It's brilliant, but also kind of unsettling how far ahead they're thinking.
Right.
They're setting themselves up to potentially dominate a market that could reshape the entire global economy.
And while all this is happening, the U.S. seems to be playing catch-up.
Yeah.
Some of their policies, particularly in trade, have inadvertently created an opening for China to step in and position itself as a more reliable partner to Mexico.
You're talking about those trade wars, the
Yes.
tariffs, and just this general sense of uncertainty that's kind of clouded U.S.-Mexico relations over the past few years. It's
Exactly.
like while the U.S. was looking inward, China saw an opportunity to forge these stronger ties with Mexico.
They offered not just investment, but a sense of stability
Right.
and long-term commitment that Mexico was really looking for.
And it seems like Mexico is buying into this new partnership. They're starting to see China as a more dependable ally in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable.
Yes,
It's a fascinating power dynamic. I mean, really fascinating.
absolutely.
I think we've done a good job of setting the stage here, exploring these shifting alliances and the motivations behind them.
Yes.
But I think to fully grasp the implications of all this, we need to dive a little deeper.
I agree. Let's delve into the potential consequences of this emerging Mexico-China partnership,
Yeah.
both for the region and for the wider world.
This is where things get really interesting.
Yes.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Oh, right.
Just kidding. We don't have any sponsors. Remember, we're just going to jump right back into this fascinating discussion.
Sounds good to me. Okay, so we've talked about Mexico making these strategic moves
Right.
to kind of bolster their economic independence. And
Yeah.
China's a big part of that shift.
They're right in the thick of it.
But what does this all mean in the long run?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
I think our listeners probably sitting there thinking like, okay, but how is this going to reshape things in North America? Like,
Yeah.
what are the possible scenarios here?
Well, one of the most immediate impacts, I think, will be in the car industry.
Okay.
As Chinese companies really get a foothold in Mexico,
Yeah.
we're going to see a lot more EVs being produced.
Okay.
And that should make them cheaper and easier to get for people across North America.
Okay, so that sounds like a win for consumers.
Yeah.
But what about the companies that are already here?
Right.
Like the American and European car makers?
They're going to have to adapt.
Yeah.
They're going to have to get creative, streamline their production, maybe even think about setting up their own factories in
Yeah.
Mexico
Right.
to stay competitive.
It's almost like this could completely restructure the whole industry with Mexico as this global hub for EV production.
Potentially, yeah.
But it's not just about cars, is it?
No, it's not.
I mean, we talked about China and their focus on lithium.
Right. That's huge.
White gold, as they call it.
That's a crucial part of this whole equation. As EVs become more popular,
Right.
the demand for lithium is only going to go up.
Yeah.
And China wants to control as much of that supply as they can.
That's a little unnerving, right?
It is.
If one country has that much control over a vital resource, that's a lot of power.
It is a lot of power. And it's a reminder for countries like the U.S. that depend on imported lithium
Right.
that they need to think about diversifying and finding strategic partners.
So it all comes back to geopolitics.
It does.
It always does.
Economics and geopolitics are inseparable.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about resources that are essential for these emerging technologies.
Exactly.
Speaking of the U.S., what do you think their response to all of this is going to be?
I think the U.S. is at a really important crossroads.
Yeah.
They need to figure out how to engage with Mexico and China in this new global landscape.
And like you said before, some of their policies haven't exactly helped. They've
Yeah.
given China a bit of an opening.
Yeah, they've created some opportunities for China to strengthen their relationship with Mexico.
So what can they do to kind of reassert themselves?
Well, they could start by taking another look at those trade policies,
Okay.
maybe try to rebuild some of that
Yeah.
trust with Mexico.
Right?
They could also look for ways to work with both Mexico and China on things that benefit everyone.
Like what?
Climate change, renewable energy, things like that.
Okay.
They need to be more diplomatic, I think.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is.
But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Mexico.
Sure.
They're in a really interesting position, aren't they?
They are. They have a chance to use their relationships with both the U.S. and China to their advantage.
It's like they're holding all the cards.
Right.
But the question is, how are they going to play this?
Exactly. What are the risks? What are the rewards?
What do you see as the potential downsides for Mexico?
Well, one risk is becoming too dependent on China
Okay.
for investment and trade. You know, it's important for them to keep their options open.
So it's about balance.
Exactly. Making the most of this partnership without putting all their eggs in one basket.
Right. They need to protect their own interests, their independence,
Absolutely.
and their relationship with the U.S.
And it's not just about the economics of it all.
Right.
There are social and environmental impacts to consider too.
Yeah. Like what?
Well, take lithium mining, for example.
Okay.
It can be very profitable
Yeah.
But it can also be really damaging to the environment if it's not done responsibly.
That's a good point. Sustainability has to be a priority,
It has to be front and center.
especially when you're talking about resource extraction.
Right.
So we've talked about the US, China, Mexico,
Yeah.
but I think our listener might be wondering, what about me? How does all this affect my life?
Right. That's the question everyone's asking.
And it's a tough one to answer, right?
Yeah, it's hard to predict the future.
But we can see some of these changes playing out already.
Absolutely.
Like we talked about EVs potentially becoming cheaper.
Right.
But what are some other ways that these global shifts might affect people's lives?
Well, as Chinese companies expand their operations in North America,
Yeah.
we're going to see more products made in China,
Okay.
which could mean lower prices for consumers.
Right.
But it also raises questions about labor practices,
Yeah.
environmental standards, things like that.
It's the double-edged sword of globalization.
Exactly.
Lower prices, but at what cost?
Right. And this is where informed consumer choices become really important.
Okay.
We have power as consumers,
Yeah.
We can support companies that align with our values.
So do your research.
Right. Think about fair labor practices,
Sustainability.
ethical sourcing, all of that.
It's about being a conscious consumer,
It is.
understanding where the things you buy come from,
Exactly.
and making choices that reflect what you believe in.
Mm.
But it's not all on the consumer, is it?
No, it's not.
What about the role of governments?
Governments have a big part to play in this.
Yeah.
They set the standards, enforce regulations, encourage international cooperation.
Yeah.
They can invest in research and development
Right.
to promote innovation in key sectors like renewable energy and EVs.
So it's a team effort.
It is. Governments, businesses, consumers, we all have a role to play.
We need to work together.
Right, to create a more sustainable and equitable future.
It's a big task.
It is a big task.
This has been a really fascinating look at this whole situation
Mhm.
between the U.S., Mexico, and China.
Yeah,
We've covered a lot of ground.
we have.
What are some key things you hope our listener takes away from this?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that the world is changing fast,
Yeah.
and we need to be ready to change with it.
It's about being flexible
It is.
and adaptable.
And having a global perspective,
Right.
understanding that we're all connected,
Yeah.
and that what happens in one part of the world affects everyone else.
It's about recognizing those connections
Absolutely.
and the power of individual actions.
Yes.
Whether it's through the things you buy or getting involved in politics or
Right.
just staying informed.
Staying engaged.
We can all make a difference.
We can.
And love that.
It's about being an active and informed citizen.
Absolutely.
And that brings us back to the purpose of these deep dives.
Right. Giving people the information they need to understand these complex issues.
Exactly.
This has been such an insightful conversation.
It has.
But before we wrap up, I want to ask you one last question.
Okay.
What advice would you give to someone who wants to stay ahead of the curve
Mm-hmm.
and really understand these global trends as they're happening?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I would say be curious.
Okay.
Read a lot. Talk to people. Challenge your own assumptions.
It's about being a lifelong learner,
It is.
keeping an open mind,
Yes.
and not being afraid of complexity.
Exactly.
I love that. Embrace the complexity.
It's all connected. And the more we understand those connections,
Right.
the better equipped we'll be to navigate this world
And create a better future.
and create a better future
For everyone.
for everyone.
That's a perfect note to end on.
I think so.
I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And for our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
I hope you found it informative.
And maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep exploring
Keep questioning.
and keep diving deep. Okay, so we've talked about all these big changes happening between the U.S., Mexico, and China. And I think our listener might be feeling a little overwhelmed. Like, what can I actually do about any of this?
Yeah, I get that. It's easy to feel powerless when you're looking at these huge global shifts.
Right, like what difference can one person really make?
Well, just understanding what's going on is a good first step. Awareness is important.
Okay, so awareness is the starting point.
Mm.
But how do we move from just watching this happen to actually doing something about it?
Yeah. One way is through our everyday choices, the things we
Yeah.
buy.
Right.
We have a lot more power as consumers than we realize.
Right.
When we support companies that are doing things the right way, it sends a message.
Like companies that are focused on ethical sourcing and sustainability.
Exactly.
So it's about voting with your wallet.
It is.
But what about our role as citizens?
That's important too. Talk about these issues with people. Reach out to your elected officials.
Okay.
Advocate for policies that promote a more just and sustainable global economy.
Don't be afraid to speak up.
Exactly. Your voice matters.
So it's a combination of things, right?
Yeah.
Individual choices and collective action.
Staying informed, being mindful, and participating in the process.
And it's a constant process, right?
It is.
Things are always changing.
Absolutely.
This relationship between the U.S., Mexico, and China is dynamic. So we need to stay engaged, keep learning.
Right. Don't let your guard down.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From these big picture shifts in power to the choices we make every day.
It's all interconnected.
It really is. And the more we understand those connections,
Yeah.
the better equipped we are to navigate all of this.
And hopefully create a better future.
A future that's more equitable and sustainable for everyone.
Exactly.
This conversation has been so insightful. I feel like our listener has a lot to think about.
I hope so.
Before we go, is there one final thought you want to leave us with?
I think it would be this. Don't be afraid of the complexity.
Okay.
The world isn't simple. There are nuances to everything that challenges the solutions.
Yeah.
Stay curious, keep asking questions, don't shy away from the hard stuff,
That's a great takeaway. Embrace the complexity, stay curious.
and keep learning.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure talking with you.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you found it valuable.
Until next time, keep diving deep.